Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. So you're ready to go when anyone starts saying, well, what do you need? And then you're able to answer it eloquently and kindly, of course, fully vested with facts. And that's why we ask you if you have time to join our Tuesday morning group coalition, something we've been doing for decades now, where we get together and discuss policy with people who can help actually craft it. If you ever felt like, how come I could write a better law than that? This is your chance to talk to some of the folks who actually do that. And I'm not even talking about the elected officials, the ones the elected officials go to for that kind of information. Also, there's our Virginia Education Opportunity Alliance, and find out more about upcoming events where we're getting together and talking about the things that we need to do to make sure the next General Assembly gets this one right. Joining us this week to kick it off is policy scholar at the CATO Institute, Chris Edwards. He's got some wonderful pieces on the spending habits of the North American politician, and it's a field guide, really. Chris, welcome to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing very good. Thanks a lot for having me.
I know that there's so much about the spending that has driven us into this brinksmanship with a deficit that's threatening to consume America's creditworthiness, and I want to get into this. But long before the inflation started to overwhelm the average American's paycheck, long before all of that, every time a government official said, well, we've got this program that we're going to invest in this, or we're going to invest, and that's the phrase they all fell in love with. We are going to take taxpayer money and invest it in this or the other thing. And I guess the premise always was that nobody else would invest in it should it show merit. When did that all metastasize to our federal spending, Chris? Is it as recently as a decade or so ago? When did they think they had to be the venture capitalist of choice?
You're right. I think, governments never they never talk about spending or deficit spending or debt. They always talk about investment. In fact, President Biden came out with his new budget a couple of weeks ago, and I actually did a word count in the budget for words like spending. The word spending in a 150-page budget document was used just 5 times, but the word investment was used 233 times.
My goodness.
The word funding, which is sort of a bloodless kind of a word, was used 230 times. So, the federal government is pushing us over a debt cliff. They're risking a giant fiscal crisis. I've been looking at the data recently. Our federal government debt reached a peak in World War II as we funded that expensive war, but even at peace now, pretty soon our debt will rise even higher than it was in World War II as a percent of the economy. So we're moving into completely uncharted territories here. And really, I hear mainly from both parties. They want to spend more on domestic priorities. They want to spend more on Ukraine. It's always more and more and more. Well, we're heading for a giant a crisis, frankly, and the politicians seem to be oblivious to it.
Well, Chris, you mentioned as a percentage of the economy. Right now, we seem to be teetering on an area that I think might even be worse than the collapse or the recession or whatever you want to call it, the bagel of 2008, because I'm watching a lot of Americans more than just grip their wallets a little bit more tightly. I'm watching restaurants close. I'm watching retail establishments close because people are just not participating in the way that we need them to in a service-based economy, where if we're not making it and we're buying it from overseas, it's going to be a problem. Talk about shrinking the American economy, as a problem first, and we'll talk about the federal spending on top of it. This is Professor Keynes' worst nightmare, isn't it?
Well, there's no doubt that as government expands, the private sector recedes. I mean, the government, when it expands, whether it's for military purposes or domestic spending of all sorts, farm subsidies or corporate welfare or whatever, it takes money out of the private sector. Then there's less money to be used for the things that we all need, money for, food and shelter and all the rest. The big problem right now is as the government has been overspending, interest rates have been rising, and so the government's giant debt load of $30 trillion, the costs of carrying that are accelerating rapidly. So if you think about the federal government's got $30 trillion in debt, every 1 percentage point of rise in interest rates costs us another $300 billion a year.
Oh my
and
gosh.
so if you look at the latest federal projections, federal interest costs have gone from $350 billion in 2021. Next year, they're going to be more than doubled, up to $740 billion. So this is the sort of a death spiral here. As interest rates rise, we've got this massive debt load. And, this is the exact sort of death spiral that countries like Greece and others have got into in the past that have created these giant economic crises. And again, I hear very little from Capitol Hill about the seriousness of the fiscal crisis that's coming ahead. And it's really unfortunate because this is going to ultimately damage all of our standard of living. If you look at, Greece got into this debt crisis a decade ago. If you look at their standard of living, it's still about 20 or 30% below what it was before they got into their crisis. So the politicians here are risking real long-term damage to the economy.
Chris, I recall when the Grecian formula didn't work out, pun intended, and it crashed. I was told by economists, "Oh, well, it's okay. We're defended because we're the reserve currency of the planet." I believe it was Davos just a month or so ago. The Saudi royal prince said, "No, we'll sell oil for other currencies. We don't have to sell for dollars." Was that a giant red flag waving that our status as the currency everyone uses, whether we burn it in piles in our own backyard or not, is in jeopardy?
The problem here is that economists and macroeconomists are often wrong. You wind the clock back a couple of years, most economists weren't worried about inflation at all. Then inflation spiked. You go back a decade leading up to the Great Recession, most economists were oblivious to it. The housing market was crashing, but economists still projected, sunny skies and economic growth ahead. Instead, we got the worst recession we'd had in decades. You see this over and over. The macroeconomists really can't forecast what's coming down the road. So what I take away from that is that policymakers ought to be prudent. We may be running into, we may have, one of the worst economic crises we've ever had because of this increase in debt as interest rates keep rising. So we ought to be prudent. We ought to guard against this by starting to cut these deficits and ultimately start paying down some of this debt. Again, going all the way back to the very first Congress in 1789, our government debt load compared to the size of the economy is now reaching an all-time high. So we're moving into completely unprecedented territories based on our entire 2-century history. So that's really not a good place for the government to be, because their irresponsibility could ultimately crash the entire economy, which damages the lifestyles and standard of living of everyone who lives in the nation.
And especially theirs, because that's when the pitchforks and torches come out. And I'm very worried, considering where we are, the rancorous nature of our vox populi right now regarding the government, whether it be, I hate Democrats or I hate Republicans. If the economy collapses and we see the kind of inflation that hit the Weimar Republic and things like that in the 30s, it's going to get ugly in the United States pretty quickly, don't you think?
You can see the civil unrest when governments need to make frankly, fairly small financial adjustments like we see in France today. I mean, the president just wants to adjust the country's retirement program by, retirement age by a couple years, and there's hundreds of thousands, millions of people in the street there. So when the crash comes, our government's going to have to take, major action, either giant tax hikes across the board, slashing Social Security benefits, and other major adjustments. And it would be much better to plan ahead now and to start making steady progress against our fiscal problems now, so that we don't reach that future stage where there is a crisis and possible civil unrest.
Chris Edwards is on with us this week from the CATO Institute, and also his work at downsizinggovernment.org, where you can visit and read so much of what we're working off of today. You have a piece that came out week and a half ago, A Century of Federal Spending, and this graph is just stunning as the hawks and the doves will circle each other, and everyone's hollering about Ukraine and the money sent to Ukraine. Your chart showing the growth in non-defense spending, really puts a lie to the idea that we've got this equal track of defense spending and non-defense spending. Talk about where we are and where we were 100 years ago, because that's what this graph really is a stunning depiction of.
Well, the amazing thing is, if you go back a century to the 1920s, federal government spending was only around 3% of GDP under, President Calvin Coolidge, very much a fiscal conservative. He held spending to about 3% of GDP. Now federal government spending is over 20% of GDP and rising quickly. What's really sad here is that in the late 20th century, from around, 1980 to 2000, the federal government, there were a lot of deficit hawks in Congress and both parties. We had a bunch of budget deals which slowed the growth in spending. And so spending was kind of flat, as a share of the economy for the last couple decades of the 20th century. But since 2000, the spending of a series of crises has ratcheted up federal government spending. 9/11, of course, then the Great Recession, and then COVID. Each time the government's responded, sensibly with some extra spending, but rather than, dialing back the spending when the crisis is over, spending has sort of ratcheted up and kept growing higher and higher. So, the last time we balanced the federal budget was back in 2001 under President Clinton. Federal spending was 17.7% of GDP. Well, today it's up to 24.2% of GDP, which is a very big expansion. So we've got a $1.5 trillion deficit today. If we had just kept spending at the same level relative to the economy as it was under President Clinton, we'd have a balanced budget today. But instead, we have this massive deficit, and we're heading toward a debt crisis. So what I'm suggesting is even just a modest amount of restraint like we had in the 1990s would go a long way to solving this problem. But, President Biden came out with his budget a couple weeks ago. He proposed an 8% increase in spending for next year, completely unaffordable. So we've really got to change course.
Meanwhile, I've seen numbers that show if you adjust for inflation, the defense spending is actually down, and the Veterans Affairs budget is decimated under the president's plan. So I don't know where all that money is going, if not to our veterans and to our defense spending, which, to be fair, if we have stood down from military engagements, and we're just right now seeking this battle in Ukraine to help Zelensky's troops. I can see that, but we certainly seem to be abandoning our men and women who have served prior to this, and I just don't think that's going to end well for the public policy officials as they go in. What is the president? Go ahead.
Yeah, there's no doubt that defense spending used to be a much bigger part of our budget. I mean, in 2023, this year, our total defense spending, including Ukraine, is going to be $800 billion. Well, that's out of a $6.2 trillion federal budget. So, we are spending a hell of a lot in Ukraine, and there are a lot of efficiencies we can find in the Pentagon. And the Pentagon bureaucracy is notoriously inefficient with multiple excess layers of bureaucracy. However, that's not where most of the spending is going today. So I looked recently on a post on CATO.org. Where has the budget increased just since 2019, before COVID started? Defense has increased 18%, but non-defense has increased 43%. Then you got entitlements like Medicaid increased 44%, and food stamps have doubled in cost from $60 billion to $120 billion just in 4 years. So the big spending these days are on these entitlements, the refundable tax credits, Medicaid, food stamps, and programs like that. That's where the real crisis in spending is coming from.
So with the debt limit ceiling looming and the economic machinations that Janet Yellen claims have gotten us, and at least until July, till the first bill comes due that we don't have any money for, metaphorically, what needs to happen? We've got the congressional leadership that held the line and said, no, we're not just going to give you a blank check to increase the debt ceiling just so you can keep spending more. So what should the fix be, Chris, here? What should the listeners be calling Morgan Griffith and Ben Klein and Bob Good and their congressional representatives here in Virginia and telling them this is what we want you to support?
I think House Republicans, who and many of them now express concern about the rising debt and deficits and want to do something about it, I think they've got to think about some realistic cuts to get the ball rolling here to try to reverse this giant spending load we've got. I fear, though, that if they try to, bite off more than they can chew, the Democrats will completely reject it. We'll get something like a government shutdown, and then ultimately Republicans will cave in the end. So I think that they have to choose some cuts that are reasonable, that the public will support them on, and that are ultimately doable, and they'll be able to stand their ground. So, for example, recently Congress has added back in earmarks, all these pork barrel projects that for a decade or so were banned. But they've added them back in now. I think House Republicans ought to stand against those and reinstitute a ban on earmarks. Okay. They ought to reverse some of this excessive welfare-style spending that has just exploded in recent years. Like I said, food stamp spending has doubled from $60 billion to $120 billion just in 4 years. I mean, that's kind of absurd. Republicans are talking about putting in tougher work requirements in some of these programs. That's a good start. I would note with the food stamp program, again, $120 billion a year of taxpayer money going to that program. About a quarter of all food stamp spending goes to junk food like cola and potato chips. I think that's absurd. So, there are efficiencies in this program that should be no-brainers, it seems to me. We should cut out the junk food spending from food stamps. You can go through a lot of the welfare programs and you can see similar amounts of waste. So I think Republicans ought to come up with a reasonable plan to start cutting some of this waste.
I recall probably about 10 years ago that Cato had done a report that showed just how much, without cutting a single program and just looking at redundancies within the federal spending, you could lop a huge chunk off of this. We've heard representatives talk about the penny plan. That's inflated it to become the nickel. Maybe it's the dime plan. Are all these sort of dog and pony shows to placate the listeners of talk radio? And they really, because they're looking at deficits from 10 years from now, 15 years from now, they're not going to get anywhere without some real hard choices right now, Chris?
That's right. I mean, it's not true that you can just sort of cut the obvious fat from the budget and the budget would be balanced. You got to cut some of the lean too. So that's why I'm saying, downsize the major programs like food stamps and Medicaid. My view is a view of reviving federalism, that the federal government should start cutting and getting out of a lot of activities that are traditionally and properly state responsibilities, like K-12 schools, welfare programs, housing programs, and that sort of thing. And, the federal government needs to cut because we've got a giant federal government deficit. State governments have balanced budgets and actually have had big surpluses in recent years. Mm-hmm. I'd say let's start getting the federal government out of some of these proper state and local activities like housing and food stamps. And if if liberal states, want to continue those programs, well, they can fund them. If more conservative states want to cut those programs, well, that should be up to them. There's no reason for a top-down national program in a lot of these policy areas. We should really leave it up to states, and if states want to fund, food stamps and housing programs, well, they can do so with their own taxes. We don't need, giant federal deficit spending to sustain these programs.
We're visiting this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, talking about federal spending and the budgets. And Chris, I want to thank you for writing some of the pieces and working the Chris Edwards Policy Scholar at the CATO Institute. You mentioned reinstituting federalism. It may not, if they wait too much longer, they may not have a choice. I know several years ago there was some controversy in Virginia where the suggestion was that we sort of, I think it was overblown. I don't think the delegate actually said start our own currency, but set aside a cushion for when Virginia has to take the responsibility for a lot of these programs. We do have a rainy day fund. I think it's very specifically set aside for things that are already Virginia's responsibility. Should the legislature be looking at rewriting how a rainy day fund is set up to become that insurance policy against a federal I don't want to say collapse, that's overly egregious, but, if all of a sudden the federal government has to abandon its spending plans?
Yeah, to the credit of most state governments, they actually have been very responsible the last decade or so. During the Great Recession a decade ago, a lot of states ran into real budget problems, but then they most of them at least learned a lesson, and they have built up large rainy day funds. So I think rainy day funds are a good idea. I mean, states are more responsible than the federal government in numerous ways. They must balance their annual budgets. Most of them, including Virginia, have hard limits on how much debt they're allowed to issue. And they have rainy day funds. This is why I think a lot of these federal programs, like housing and welfare and the like, ought to be moved back to the state level, because states can fund these programs, but in a reasonable and balanced way, that they've got to, balance it against other priorities. They've got to make trade-offs, and they've got to balance their annual budget. So states are fundamentally, they're more responsible in their budgeting, and that's why it seems to be most programs ought to be funded and run by the states, and the federal government ought to get out of a lot of these areas.
Plus, being closer to the recipients of this aid, it becomes easier to make sure that it's aid that's necessary rather than aid that's just kind of following bad aid after good. And at some point, we have to look at, and you mentioned some of the dollar figures. I mean, we are still an economy that generates a massive amount of collections. I hate it when they use the word revenue as if somehow the government earned it. But taxation policy has, it's not like the government has an income problem right now. Is that a concern also going forward, that at some point the economy is going to soften to the point where we're not generating the collections at the federal level, Chris?
No, that's exactly right. And, of course, the federal government has no source of money other than Americans who live in the 50 states. Mm-hmm. There's no magical source. There's no money tree in Washington. And that's often the way you see politicians talk about it. They'll often say things like, oh, we're going to inject this much spending into the economy and the like. Well, of course, they have to, get the money by sucking it out of the private sector and individuals who live in the 50 states. And this is one big argument. it seems to me, for decentralization, rather than Virginians paying taxes to Washington for things like schools and highways and the rest. Why not just pay the money to Richmond? Richmond can allocate and make trade-offs and spend on priorities that Virginians really want, rather than the money going to Washington and go through all the giant bureaucracies. So I've never heard any good arguments for why spending on domestic activities should be centralized in Washington. Everyone knows Washington is incredibly wasteful. The money is doled out based on political patronage and power politics and not on actual needs. State capitals are not wholly clean, of course. There are inefficiency problems there as well. But I think ultimately they have to be more responsible because they have to balance their budget and they've got to respond to what their local citizens really need.
Well, and if you look at it, if a dollar goes into Washington and then comes back to whatever state sent the dollar in the first place, it's only about 40 cents last time I saw, with the cost of that, administering that bureaucracy. The pass-through rate of a federal bureaucracy is horrific, Chris.
I've looked at a lot of programs in particular. If you look at like housing programs, for example, the HUD will cost, X dollars in housing programs, but if you actually look at a lot of that money is actually stays in Washington in the bureaucracy, and it actually doesn't go back to the states, as you said. So there's this basic inefficiency that when you channel all the programs the money for local programs through Washington, a lot of it stays in Washington, which is of course why Washington has the counties surrounding Washington have some of the highest per capita incomes in the nation.
He's about to ask with tongue firmly planted in cheek, lest any of you think I'm actually serious about being concerned about this. What are we going to do, Chris, with the massive unemployment amongst all these bureaucrats in Washington? I mean, I'm not sure. Some of them must be qualified to do something besides administer the secretariat of whatever department it is.
I call it the Imperial City on the Potomac. It is sort of becoming like ancient Rome in that it's become a massive high income region. It's the members of Congress, of course. It's the 10 or 20,000 staffers who work for them. It's all the lawyers and the lobbyists and the trade associations. It really is a massive redistribution system we've set up in Washington. And it's not just that Washington redistributes money between districts based on political power. It's that a lot of the redistribution goes right to people who live in and around the Beltway in D.C. It's frankly, it is curious that the political left often complains about rich people and the like, but their big government policies are the ones that are creating this great inequality in the nation between the inside government elites and everyone else.
It's interesting you bring up Rome, Chris, because the parallels can be so stunning at times as each successive emperor and as we watch an administration, I think this is the third administration that really has circumvented the legislative process and is just governed with a pen and a phone, to borrow from a previous president's rhetoric, that you have these cabinet divisions with massive bureaucracies, the ability to write law under policy guidelines, and police departments on top of most of them, like EPA and such. So you really do have this imperial White House that goes on, but beyond that, when you look at the spending that each successive one has made, at the end, if I'm not bastardizing my history lessons, Rome didn't fall to a battle. Rome just sort of said, "Yeah, whatever. Whoever's in charge, you want to be in charge, go ahead." I mean, they never really put up a fight over the collapse. They just woke up one morning and the emperors and all were gone.
I don't know how we're going to get out of our current situation, without making serious reforms to the budget. That is the core problem here, is the centralization of spending and taxing and administrative power in Washington. I've written many pieces at CATO.org about, why there's no advantage in all this centralization. There are only disadvantages in centralizing all of these activities. With all this, the hundreds of billions of dollars that are grabbed by the federal government and then showered back down onto the states, comes this vast pile of regulations. So with the spending comes all the regulatory power. Mm-hmm. And so there's a double reason why we want to start cutting the spending and get this budget back in balance, is to help cut all these regulations that come with the school programs and the highway programs and the health programs and the like, that micromanage the life of state and local governments and the private sector. The way to cut all their top-down regulation is to cut the spending in Washington.
Chris, let me ask you this, and certainly the pieces you've written, but I'm interested in your thought as you talk about the bureaucracy and what it has become in Washington, D.C. The ruling by the Supreme Court, West Virginia versus EPA, that says, by the way, Chris Edwards on with us from CATO. Pardon me, I'm just on a roll here, because something you said really triggered me to remember the West Virginia versus EPA ruling from just last year that insisted that all these bureaucratic regulations have to come with specific legislation now. Have you noticed that changing this at all, or have they just ignored this ruling and are going on in pretty much the same pace they were doing before?
I haven't followed that particular ruling, but my understanding is that the regulations are pouring out of the Biden administration at a pretty rapid clip. You know, you can look at the page count in the Code of Federal Regulations and that sort of thing to get a sense of the regulations. But there's no doubt that the regulations for environment and many other things have been pouring out of Washington. And again, so some of that would be possible without the spending, but it's the spending that really puts it on hyperdrive. I mean, when the federal bureaucrats are micromanaging what is in school lunches or what the curriculum in your local school is, or how your health plan works and that sort of thing, that's all driven by the spending. Mm-hmm. It's the same, even with something like farm subsidies. American farmers are happy to get the $25 billion or so a year in subsidies, but when they take the subsidies, the federal government micromanages exactly, essentially, what they grow and where they grow it and how many acres they're allowed to grow it on and how many acres must lie fallow and that sort of thing. So with the spending comes the micromanagement, and I think it's a really damaging thing, and it's really un-American to have so much of our economic life now decided by the elected and unelected politicians and bureaucrats in Washington.
So is there a fix for it? I mean, we've touched on a bunch of different topics that put us in economic peril. I think the most existential one is losing the status as the reserve economy. A lot of my friends point to China, saying they're just laughing all the way back to Beijing because this is exactly what they want, is they want an American government collapsing under its own economic weight. Russia is laughing, saying, "Ha, you thought it was funny when you did this to us during the Cold War." Is this a global issue that is going to wind up, creating an even bigger, crisis for all those countries that claim to be our allies and count on us to back them up in their international entanglements when that dollar goes poof?
So there's two issues here. That globally, the U.S. government has this massive and worsening debt problem. What makes it even more scary is that most other Western governments have similar or even worse debt problems. So all these governments are going to be, greatly increasing the borrowing over the next few years, all at the same time. I don't know where all the creditors to support all the debt are going to come from. And then domestically, the optimistic view would be that, in the past, like in the 90s when interest rates spiked and federal interest costs went through the roof, there was a lot of effort starting in the Reagan administration through the Clinton administration to start dealing with the high deficits. And then we did get the deficits down and actually balanced the budget for 4 years under President Clinton. So maybe as the economic crisis starts to hit, there will be a real push to the politicians to start acting more responsibly. We have seen with a spike in inflation the last couple of years a realization among some federal politicians that all this spending isn't free. There's a real cost to it. There's no doubt that all this deficit spending in recent years has pushed up inflation up to 8%, and now is still running at around 5 or 6%. That's causing real pain and real cost to average Americans, and that is what causes the politicians to wake up when their constituents are getting hammered and hurt by all that spending. So hopefully, the rise in interest rates and inflation are a wake-up call to the politicians to reverse course and to start downsizing the federal budget.
Well, I do know history, global history, whenever an economy, a free country's economy collapses, a dictator is not too far over the horizon, even if they, like in Rome, just use the Senate as a buffer to keep people thinking everything was fine. But Napoleon, all these places, when the economy collapses, chaos ensues, followed by a strongman dictator. And I'm not sure we want to go that way. So hopefully folks are listening to what you have to say about this. Chris Edwards, downsizinggovernment.org, policy director policy scholar for economic issues at the CATO Institute. I do deeply appreciate your time this weekend, and thank you so much for doing this. And please go read more of his columns there, and you have a great weekend, sir.
Hey, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
And more Freedom and Prosperity Radio coming up next.